Hey, John Morris here, and in this video we're going to talk about how to write a PHP class. So the benefit of a class, well, there's a number of them. One, it helps you as a developer keep your code a lot more organized because you can organize your code into different classes that do certain things, and that'll allow you to keep from having code just kind of everywhere. Not only that, it helps make it more reusable because when you put it into a class, there's certain things that you have to do when you write a class that make it so pretty much you can take that class anywhere and put it inside any script, and you can still use it inside of that script, and that can be very helpful. And then the third thing is it helps with any kind of conflicts you might have with other scripts. And now that becomes especially important when you're in an environment like WordPress where you have a bunch of other plugins and those are basically all put into kind of the same namespace inside of WordPress. So if you write a plugin and you don't put it inside of a class and you give one of your functions a name, then if there's another plugin anywhere inside WordPress that itself is inside of a class and has that same function name, it's going to cause a conflict because you can only have one function. Each function has to be unique. You can't have two functions with the same name inside of what's called kind of the same namespace. So by creating a class, essentially what you do is you kind of create your own namespace. So as long as the name of your class doesn't have the same name as any other class that happens to be inside of that particular namespace, then you're okay. You can name any of your functions inside of your class whatever you want, and it doesn't matter as long as they're not the same as any other function inside your own class. So it kind of helps you create your own little namespace where you can write functions then how you want. Now, there's really two main ways that you're going to use a class. One is that you're going to use a class as kind of a library. And what I mean by that is you're going to write a class, and inside of that class, then you're going to have a bunch of different functions, and those functions don't necessarily work together with one another. They're just a collection of functions that you can then call elsewhere in your code, and you can call them from that class and use them. So one example of that might be like a database class. Now, there's parts of most database classes where the code does all go together, but in a database class, you're also going to have a function for inserting data. You're going to have a function for retrieving data. You're going to have a function for deleting data, and so forth. Or you may. It just depends how you write it, but you're going to have functions for all of those different things, all the different main things that you'll do with a database. Now, the insert function doesn't rely on the delete function, and the delete function doesn't rely on the update function. So they don't really rely on one another. Now, you may write some other functions inside of that class where all of those particular insert, update, delete, retrieve, all those different functions may rely on some other functions you write, but again, it's kind of a library where you can call the individual functions inside of your class, and you don't have to constantly rewrite that code. So that's the first way. It's kind of like you have a library of different functions that you can easily access. You write once, you can add it to any script that you use, and you have your database functions or whatever the class does. The second thing that you use a class for is what I personally refer to. I just call it kind of like a robot. So this class is designed to do one thing and one thing only, and in that case, all of the functions inside of that class work together to create for you a final output. Now, in that sense, some cases where you might use that for, you might use a class like that for parsing an XML feed. So you write this XML parser class, and all you have to do is give that class the URL of the XML or the RSS feed that you want to parse. It'll grab the data from that RSS feed, and it'll run it through all of the functions inside of that class, and at the end it will give you a certain output that you expect. Okay, so that is kind of like a robot where you write this class and you write all the functions inside of it to literally do just one thing and give you a very finite set of output. And that can be very useful because, again, you can write, let's say again, a XML parser. You can write this class and have it give you the output you expect, and then you can take that along with you. You don't really ever have to rewrite that code again. You can take it with you wherever you go, and you can use it to parse RSS feeds everywhere, because now this is not entirely true, but most RSS feeds follow a fairly standard format, or will have at least some of similar data in them. So and the way it's structured, so you can use it to parse a number of different RSS feeds. You don't have to continually rewrite that code. And so again, I refer to this as kind of a robot, where you give it something and it does its thing and it spits back out to you what you want. So that's the other way that you can write a class. And in that instance, the functions inside of that class do rely on one another. They all work together and build upon one another to parse that code, or to do whatever it is you want it to do, and ultimately give you the output you want. So those are kind of the two main ways that you're going to use classes. Now, and we're going to look at some of that when we start getting into the practical examples and talking about, different ways to do different things. We're going to be using a database class. We're going to be using some other classes to do certain things that we want our code to do, or we want our application to do. But in this kind of how to write a PHP class, I want to show you kind of the basics and some of the important things that you need to know with working with classes. So the first thing that I want to show you is actually how to write a class. So as you can see, here we have our class.php file, and we have our PHP tags just like normal. And the way we start this off then is we use an if statement. And essentially what we're doing in this if statement is we're checking to see if there's a class name, there's a class out there in this particular namespace that already has the name that we want to give to our class. And that just helps with conflicts. Again, this is a little more important when you're working in an environment like WordPress or Joomla or whatever the case may be, Drupal, where you're going to have multiple plugins and you never know what someone else is going to name their class. Now, when you're writing a self-contained application where it's not going to be inside WordPress, it's just its own application, typically you don't have to worry too much about this because you are the one writing everything, so you know what's going to be on there. So, and this doesn't work, for example, if you write two separate applications, they don't necessarily share the same namespace. So you don't have to worry about those two applications conflicting. It's when you're working with, say, like WordPress or Drupal or whatever, the reason you have to worry about it is because ultimately WordPress, even though it's so big and you have all these plugins and all that stuff, WordPress is one application. So all of the functions and classes inside of it share the same namespace. So that's what you got to keep in mind. Now, again, if you're developing your own application, self-contained, you don't really have to worry about it, but it is good practice. So essentially what we're calling a function called class exists, and it will check the namespace to see if the variable or the parameter that we pass into that function exists. And actually what we're doing is to see if it does not exist, because we're putting the exclamation in front. So if this class does not exist, then we're going to create it. Okay, so that's essentially what we're doing here with this if statement. Now, once we've done that, then to actually create the class, you can see it's pretty simple. We just write class and then the name that we want our class to have, and it's as simple as that. And then we, of course, put our curly brackets here to open that space, and then inside of here is where we actually create all of the properties and methods for our class. Now, to kind of make that crossover, when you're talking about a class, essentially variables, just like you would use outside of class, like we've talked about so far, variables inside of a class are called properties, and functions inside of a class are called methods. Okay, so when we're talking about properties and methods, all we're really still talking about is variables and functions. Now we're just talking about them inside of a class. And the reason that that's done is really to conform with other object-oriented programming languages, where inside of those languages they're not called variables and functions, they're called properties and methods. So it's really kind of a conformity thing for people who may have programmed in C++ or some other programming language, and they come over to PHP and they want to do object-oriented programming, and they're reading the manual and things like that. It's using terminology that they would understand. Okay, so that's probably the primary reason why that's done. Now, so again, we have you can see I'm declaring a property here, which is, again, it's declared just like a variable. The only difference is we put this statement in front called public, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute when we talk about visibility, and we're going to again talk about that here in just a second. But really it's just the same thing as declaring a variable, and then you can see we have our function down here, and we're passing in a parameter. And it's really just the same thing as creating a function, except again we put this term public in front of it. And so we have a variable and we have a function that exists inside of our class. Okay, so now we can access that property and that method from anywhere in our script now. So again, we could write a whole bunch of methods inside of here that work together to create a certain output, or we can write a bunch of functions or a bunch of methods inside there that are kind of like a library that we can access. So there's two different things that we can do. And actually, let's go ahead and change this. So that you can see exactly what this does. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually referencing the property. Okay, so we have two things on here. First, once we've written the class, you can see that we've ended our class here. So only stuff inside of here is going to be a part of our class. We've ended our if statement. So now whenever you write a class, in order to use it, you have to do what's called instantiate it. So here, this is what we're doing. We're instantiating our class, which is essentially we're saying this variable class is now an object, is this object here. And so it's basically with this variable we can then reference the properties and the methods inside of that class. So you can see here I'm doing an echo and I'm doing class, and then I'm doing this variable called property, and I'm echoing that out. So it should echo property. And then here I'm doing echo class, and I'm referencing our method here with a parameter, and so I'm passing in this parameter. So it should echo out these words parameter right here. And so if we head over to our web page here, you can see that initially we have our property. Again, if we kind of bring back up our code, that is this variable right here, which is being referenced from now outside of the class. We're referencing it in our code here. So we have access to that property, and then we also have access to the method. And you'll see that this method is calling, again, our property variable, and then it's also calling the parameter that gets passed. So if we go back to our page, we can see that we have property and parameter. So we're echoing all that out property. Now, a little bit on this part right here. So essentially what this does is it's a kind of a global variable that will allow you to reference any property or method inside of the current class. So again, we're inside of our class, and when we use this, we can reference this property here, and instead of having to write out our class, we can just use this, and it will reference that property within this current class. The same thing, you can do that for a method, so you could reference a method inside of here as well. So that's what this allows us to do. So that's really what there is to a class. Again, it's just a matter of creating the class, putting some properties and methods inside of it, and then referencing those properties and methods after or outside of this class once we've instantiated it. Now, the way that this would normally work in most cases is you would write this class inside of one file and call it class.php or database class.php or whatever, then you would use your includes or your requires to include it into another file. And once you've done that and it's instantiated, whether it's in the original file or you instantiate it inside of the file you're including it into, you can instantiate it either place. Then once you do that, you'll have access to that class and you can call any of the properties and methods inside of it. So that's what makes it powerful, because you can write, for example, a database class and write all the code for that class in one file. Then when you want to actually start using it, you simply include that file into your code of whatever other file you're creating, your new file, and you'll have access to all of the methods and all the properties inside of it, and you can call those right from within that code instead of having to constantly rewrite that stuff. And again, when we get into the practical examples, you're going to see this in action. But again, just to write one, you just need to define your class here like this, and then you put in your properties and you put in your methods. And then to reference it outside of it, you instantiate the class, and then you again simply reference them just like you would an object, like when we were working with arrays and things like that. So that's how you do that. Now, the next thing I want to show you is visibility, and visibility can get a little bit more tricky, so I want to kind of step through this. So we talked about the public, the protected, and the private, and those are different visibility that you can give to both properties and methods. So we're going to talk about this in terms of properties, but this also applies to methods in the exact same way. And not only that, but you'll probably use it with methods a little bit more, but it's easier to understand with properties, I think. So you can see that we have a public property, we have a protected property, we have a private property. Okay, so the way that works is that a public property can be accessed anywhere. Okay, a protected property can be accessed only inside of itself, any parent classes, which we'll talk about in a second, or any inherited classes. So again, we'll talk about that here in a second. I'm going to show you that. And then a private property or method can only be accessed within the class that defines it. So in this case, our R class, this function here, or this property, could only be accessed within this class. Now, until you know about parent and child classes, that really doesn't make too much sense, but we're going to talk about that here in a second. So let's talk about parent and child classes. So in this instance, our parent class is this R class right here, because it's the first one. It's the one that, it's not necessarily because it's the first one we created, but down here what we're doing, again, you can see we have if class exists function here doing the same thing like up here, but then we have class, child class, which creates a new class, but then we're saying extends our class. That turns this into a child class and makes this its parent class. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to have this parent class where you have properties and methods inside of it, and now by using this extends and referencing this class, all of the properties and methods that were available inside this class are now available to this class, except for any private methods or properties that you've created inside here. So private methods and properties are only available to the class that created them. They're not going to be available to any child classes. And so there's certain instances where you may or may not want to do that, but that's the difference between a private class and a protected class. Now, a protected class, the methods and properties that you've set as protected will still be available to this child class, but it won't be available anywhere outside of either one of these classes. So, for example, if we come down here, you can see that we've instantiated both of our classes here. And we have we're echoing out our public property that we have up here. And we're in our class2.php file. So if we come over and we go to class2.php, you can see it's echoing out public, which is the value of the public property that we've declared inside of this class. And again, we're instantiated our parent class and we're referencing our parent class here. Now if I come over here and I try to echo out the protected variable, and we come back over here, you're going to see that I get an error because you see it says I cannot access protected property. So it's only available inside of the class. It's not available outside of it. And then of course to any parent classes that we have here. So again, we can't reference it directly from outside the class. And again, there's certain instances where you may or may not want to do that. Now, if we go and we do the private class, of course, we know that we're going to get an error because we can't access that outside of the class either. That's only available inside the class that sent it. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But now when you start talking about inheritance, let's go ahead and comment all these out. Oh, and let's take a look at, now what we're doing here is we have a method inside of our primary class that is referencing our private property here, okay? So since it's being referenced from within this class and then echoed out to our echoed out here, we can reference it. So if we do this and we come back over, you can see that now we can access it. Okay, so we can't access it directly, but we can access it through another method or even another property from inside that class as well, like we just did here. Okay, so now when we're talking about inheritance, then you can see we have we're going to echo child and public. So our child class, which is this class down here, is extending our parent class. So it has all of the same, it has all the public and protected functions and methods and properties. So this public property is a public one, so it will be transferred to or inherited by the child class. So we should be able to echo this out. So if we come over here and we look at it, you can see that we have access to it. Now, if we go to our protected property here, again, protected properties can be accessed by the child class. So we should still be able to access this. However, we are accessing it directly again, and as we know from what we learned up here, that accessing it directly is not going to work. So we're not going to be able to access this one. Next one is private, and of course we know that again, the private one is not even available to our child class, so our child class won't even have this property set, and we'll get an error that says that property doesn't even exist. Okay, so that's what happens with that one. Now we have what's called our protected method. So our protected method is accessing our protected property from our parent class, but is doing it inside of a method. Instead of accessing it directly from outside the class, we're accessing it from inside the class. And again, as we talked about, inside the class, a protected property or function we can access from inside the class. So here we should be able to then see or echo out this property. So we'll go ahead and save that. And if we come back over and we refresh, you can see that we have our protected value here. Now, when it comes to private, our private property isn't even available to our child class. And inside our child class, we have a method called private method that is referencing that private property. But since this child class can't access that property, it's not even going to exist inside this child class. So when we try to echo this out, it should throw us an error because we don't have access to it. So if we refresh, you can see that we get an error, and you notice it says undefined property. That's because since our child class can't even access that private property from our parent class, it doesn't even know it exists. So it says it's an undefined property. Okay, so that's how visibility works. Again, public properties and functions can be accessed anywhere. Protected ones can be accessed inside the parent class and any inherited or child classes. And then private functions and properties can only be accessed within the class that defines it. Okay, So there's, again, as you start developing code, this may not, you may not necessarily know why you would want to do this, but as you start developing code, you're going to have instances where you only want certain values or certain properties and certain methods. You only want them available to the class that they're within, and they work within that class, and that's it. They're not, you can't be accessed anywhere else outside of that. And then you're going to have ones that you're going to want to make available to child classes, but you're not going to want to have them be able to be accessed directly from outside your classes. And then of course you're going to have some where you want those to be accessed anywhere, and that's when you're going to use those different visibilities. All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what's called a constructor. Okay, so what a constructor does is it is a method inside of a class that will be run automatically whenever the class is instantiated. So it's good for any kind of initialization that you might want to do when the class is initially instantiated, so that you don't have to then in your code do all of that stuff. So a good example of this where I use it is with database classes, because as you know, when you're working with a database, there's a number of things you have to do when you work with the database. You have to have all your variables and connect to the database or connect to MySQL. Then you have to select your database and all that stuff that you have to do. When you use a construct method, you can put all of that stuff inside of your construct. And when you instantiate the class like we see down here, it'll automatically do all of that stuff so that you can then, right then, after it's instantiated, start accessing different functions from inside of your class. And again, when we get into the practical examples, I'm going to show you this. We're going to actually walk through a database class, and I'm going to show you how that's done and how you can kind of make that a little bit easier for yourself. So when we're talking about a construct, again, it occurs automatically when you instantiate the class. Now, if you look here, I've added 2 parameters here. If you want your class to have parameters, you need a construct method inside of your class, and that construct method has to take parameters. So these parameters on this construct method become the parameters for your class. So you can see I have parameter 1 and parameter 2, and all I'm simply doing is echoing them out, and then here I'm instantiating the class and I'm passing these 2 parameters in our class name here. So again, the parameters of your construct method become the parameters of your class. Okay? And again, that's when we talk about a database, then that's when you can start a database class. That's when you can kind of start to see how it works, because when you create this class, you can ask for the host, you can ask for the database username, the database password, the database name. You can ask for all the database details as parameters for this construct method or for your class. So that way, whenever you instantiate the class, then you pass in those parameters, and then you can use that in your construct method to automatically connect to MySQL, select the proper database, open the connection using the proper credentials, and so forth. And then of course, we'll get a little more advanced. We'll talk about where you can actually create a config file, and instead of having to, every time you instantiate the class, put in the actual values, you can just put in the constants from your config file. But we'll get to that. So here you can see all we're doing is instantiating this class, and we're passing in the parameters. You notice I'm not calling any method directly. All I'm doing is instantiating the class. So if we come back over and we go to this class3.php file and I refresh, you can see it's echoing these out. And again, all I'm doing is instantiating the class. And the reason that it's echoing them out is because the construct method is going to run automatically when it's instantiated. Okay, so it's automatically echoing these out when I instantiate it. And that's what a construct method allows you to do. Okay, so those are kind of the major things when it comes to creating a class. First, just the syntax and how to actually create it. Second, working with parent and child classes and dealing with visibility in those instances. And then the third thing is working with the construct method. To me, those are the 3 most important things, because when you get those things, then you can kind of start to build some pretty advanced scripts and applications. And there's other things to learn in terms of classes, but these are the ones I think are initially most important for you to learn to get you going. And then the other things you'll just kind of pick up as you go. So again, learning how to actually the syntax for creating a class, the visibility and working with parent-child classes, and then working with constructs and automatically doing things when the class is instantiated. So that's how to write PHP classes. Hopefully you found that helpful, and I'll talk to you again soon.